when we talk to clients like 3-4 years ago, hey, there's this new quantum safe stuff coming, they were asking, how many new servers do I have to buy? Do they fit in my data center? What they didn't ask is, what does it do to the network bandwidth of my data center, which they should have, as you will see. So back then there were encouraging results from cycle counts, from synthetic performance measurements, and so on and so forth. But then at some point we said, wait a second, if you use these algorithms, ML-KEM, ML-DSA, in protocols, a lot of additional stuff has to happen. You have to allocate memory. If you have hybrid ones, you need to combine the two keys into one, and so on and so forth. So that was leading us to the motivation. We want to actually know how these individual algorithms perform inside the TLS 1.3 protocol, and that's what the talk today is about. So I'm not sure how many of you are working with TLS all the time. So this is about session establishment. So this picture here shows how a session establishment in TLS 1.3 is doing, is actually working without hello retry requests, so a simplified version. And let me highlight just a couple of things here on this slide. So point one, it's important to understand what is exchanged are TLS records. So they are transported over TCP layer 4, but they're easily recognizable as TLS records, which is layer 5, and then if you look into it, layer 6. So you can identify those blobs, if you want, that are being sent forth and back on TCP. That's one thing to recognize here. The other is I highlighted then a couple of these actions, the establishment of a common key, for example, the key creation and so on and so forth. So that's where the algorithms really kick in. So what you can see is that either before a TLS record is being sent or after it's received, some of those actions need to happen, which then somehow involves these algorithms. So if you say, okay, those are TLS records, OpenSSL has this nice feature of being able to establish a callback function, which then notifies us whenever OpenSSL is starting to actually process a TLS record. And obviously we have the clock get time function, so we can actually quite accurately measure the CPU time, so the amount of work on a CPU, which eventually means how many servers, how many CPU cycles do I need to have available in my data center is there. And last but not least, the OpenSSL library at least is processing all these steps in a sequence. So now if you put everything together, we realize that the onset of a processing of one of these records is, from a CPU cycle perspective, the end of the previous one. So we have a starting and an ending timestamp, which means we can measure how long does it take on the CPU to process it. So if you do that, and we look at this on the client side, so what you see here is on one side we use different certificates and one group, and the opposite on the other side. So you see either the group or the certificates. We post these results over the individual TLS session establishment steps, and we show the accumulated CPU time here. So those are the typical measurements that you get out if you do these timestamps and produce it nicely versus the y-axis having the time. How does this help us? Well, if you look at how that works on the client, we can now identify in which steps we can look at what operation. So we can, for example, between the connect call and the time the client sends out ClientHello, obviously the client has to produce a key pair such that it can send its key share to the other side. Once the ServerHello comes back as the next step, only then the client can start to actually create the common secret out of that information. So we can kind of pinpoint in which of these steps, which algorithms are then being used. Similarly, on the other side, for the certificate, for the authentication function, so we can look at the decryption of extensions. We can see then, and on the server side, or on the certificate side, I should better say, it's a little more complicated because there a number of things happen. So you need to do a digest, then you need to sign it, then you need to send it over, which means you have to encrypt it. So there's a little more complicated to extract the data. But I think you get the principle. Same thing on the server side. We can pinpoint where the server is actually creating the keys and derives a common secret for the key agreement. And similarly, on the authentication side, we can identify in which step what operation is happening. So, one thing I want to highlight is that on the server side, if you look at the ML-KEM operation, it's no longer really a new key pair that is established. It's just one encapsulation step, which means before it was generate key pair, generate common secret. Now it's only one step, encapsulate, which has some performance implications. So how did we measure that whole thing? The setup was we took a Ice Lake type server, Intel CPU, which had an abundant number of cores and threads, and more importantly, it had 2 physical CPUs. So what we did is we wrote a little C client and a little C server, and we pinned the server and the client to individual cores. We took 2 full cores, which means 4 threads, a real thread in Intel notation and a helper thread, so to speak, if you know what I mean. So we could actually kind of separate those also by putting those on different CPUs. We used a number of OpenSSL build options. If you want to know about that, then you're in the wrong room, because Damash is right now in the other room explaining how to get all of that. What else to mention here? We did 10,000 warm-up loops and then 100,000 measurement loops to really get quite a good repeatability of less than plus minus 1% in the figures. So I would say the numbers you will see are accurate to a couple of microseconds at max. One little thing I want to mention, even though here it shows that we had the client and the server in 2 containers, because I really wanted to have the latest and greatest, which is 3.5 whatever. I couldn't do the 3.6 unfortunately, because that would have taken too long time. It was just released last week. So it's actually both are sitting in the same container, just to be open in that. So then what are the numbers? Key agreement. That's how it looks like. So I don't go into the numbers themselves. But you can see we can nicely separate on the client side how long does it take to generate the key, how long does it take to derive a common secret from the own key share, the private key plus the key share we get from the server. On the server we can then combine that into the generation of the common key, and last but not least we can also say how long does it take overall. So in summary, we do have a winner, yeah! ML-KEM 5.12 is really fast. In what I tested. When we then go to the next one, so the ML-KEM 768, the 1024, compared to the X5519 and the P256, I mean, if we talk about milliseconds, they deviate about plus minus 50 microseconds. For me, that's ballpark the same. So I'm really happy with saying, okay, whether you use 768 or whether you use P256, don't worry too much, dear clients. It won't fill your data center with new servers. If you then go to protection against harvest now, decrypt later, well, it adds like 250 microseconds, which is 25%. So that's not to completely neglect anymore, but still okay in my analysis. You might come to a different conclusion. But then if you go then to the X448 or the P521, let alone the 384, and then I don't know who came to the idea to combine the ML-KEM 1024 with the P384. I mean, we talk about 1.8 milliseconds just for the key agreement. It's horrible. It's 5,000, it's 5x slower. So, I mean, can't we have an X25519 ML-KEM 1024? I mean, everybody is using P256 and X25519 today, and only because NSA said, you must go to level 5, somebody, I don't know, in IETF or somewhere else, I don't know, decided, now we need to add the 384. I mean, just look at here. I mean, this is kind of okay. And as soon as you go to the 521s and 384s, I mean, boom, it explodes, right? So I'm asking standards body and cryptographers to actually consider to also offer us these two. So now let's go to the next step, sign and verify the handshake messages. So you can also see where on the client and the server side we measure those. Before I go into the details there, and I do have to highlight a few things. When we heard Dave speak this morning, he said, ML-DSA, they're kind of the same, they're just bigger. Well, they are not just bigger. So what I did is here, I present the percentile distribution versus the time, the CPU time, for actually doing such a sign on the, sorry for that, a sign on the server side. And I was always verifying, is my setup okay? So I looked at these quantiles and they were kind of flat with a little tweak at the end and a little dip on first. And when I saw that, I said, what am I doing wrong? Because I didn't know that the lithium thing, which is the base, has this feature of resampling. So they convinced themselves that the signature somehow is good enough with some math magic. I don't understand, but I don't have to. I only have to understand that if they convince themselves the signature is not good enough, they redo it. And that happens like, you know, for 25-ish%. So if you look at the theoretical rejection sampling probabilities and map those over, and it's dilithium versus ML-DSA, so it's not 100% the same percentage, but close. I mean, I have a chance of like 25% to get the valid signature the first time. And then I do it again, 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 and I go up like crazy. And I mean, those are unbounded. I mean, there's a non-zero chance that it will take to infinity. Now that's kind of scary, right? So for now, we show the results for the 50% quantile, but please, cryptographic algorithm community, give us something that either has a much higher shift where actually resample happens, or come up with algorithms that don't do resampling again. And we will see in a minute why I'm so strong about it. But let's look at the results. So before we go to the actual numbers, let me highlight something. So the good thing is, if for leaf certificate with P256, the server has less work to do than the client. Now, with the ML-DSA versions, the server has to do more than the client. From the color coding red and green, you immediately recognize I'm a server guy. I'm not an IoT guy. IoT guys would actually change the color coding and said, yeah, the client has to do less work, and let's do the heavy lifting on the server side. On the other side, if you're an aggregation point, like an ingress controller, like you have a cloud, if you have Cloudflare or Google type of stuff, if you have big web shops, you are concerned about where all the aggregation happens. And you say, I have 1 million clients out there, they could easily do some more work. If I have to do some more work, that's a problem for my data center. So that's a first observation. If you actually look at the different figures, well, for the client, we all know RSI is really good for clients, really bad for servers, and the opposite is true for P256. And we add on the client, depending on which ML-DSA version you're using, 200, 300, 400 microseconds, and then on the server, the same thing. So at the end, we end up with, compared to the P256, with something 500, 800, 1.4 milliseconds, which already is kind of a lot. Right? So you also can see how much more work the server actually has to do. So this is for the 15% quantile, the fastest you can get. So what's the full story? Well, that is the full story. That is the full story. So you can see on the one hand side, you have the legacy stuff. they behave really nicely over the quantiles. They're really flat. But the ML-DSA versions, they have an unbounded growth. Now, why is this so nasty? Well, if the server is highly loaded, meaning typically you have n requests coming in, but you can only process in real parallel, meaning on hardware threads, n divided by a certain factor, this means the other requests pile up. They're just delayed, and then at some point are being processed. Now, if the guys in front all of a sudden have these tail latencies, all clients, or the majority of the clients, will see tail latencies. I'm telling you, cloud people hate tail latencies, because if you have it in one place, you have it everywhere. So tail latencies is really bad. So that's it. So for the verification of the certificates, that's kind of okay. It's the certificates that count here and the signatures on the certificate. So there are a couple of options people have. They can either send the root certificate or not. They can even verify the root certificate or not. Now, usually people don't verify a root certificate because it's most probably self-signed anyway, so why verify a self-signature? But we did the measurement either way for two-chain certificates, so we had the leaf and the root, and we sometimes verified the root or not, just to also capture the situation where instead of a root, you would have an intermediate certificate to also capture that. Okay, so let's look at what that does, and we can see the P521 is really the orange line that goes through the roof, and the good news is all ML-DSA versions beat that 521, which, I mean, and that's again in the, no, that's a verification where you don't have resampling, so that's again the 50% quantile. If you have a more than two-stage certificate chain, so not just leaf and root, but you have some intermediate in it, then it basically doubles the latencies, and as you can see on the y-axis, here we talk about millisecond or so that is added. So that's no longer the 50 plus minus 50 microseconds we had in the key agreement. Here it really starts to add up. Then in terms of numbers, if you're using an ML-DSA 44, 65, 87 instead of a P256 and or RSA 4K, it adds something like 100, 200, 400 microseconds. So if we always add these hundreds of microseconds, what does it really do to us? So what I show here, a lot of figures, I don't talk about the figures, the 15%, 50% and 99% quantiles. Let me first look at the harvest now, decrypt later, where you basically see that in the 50% quantile, and it's not much different in the 99% quantile, as already shown, it adds like 25%. But we have to keep in mind, server load goes up 33%, which has some impact on resource planning. On the other side, if we add now the certificates, I mean, they really have an impact. So you can see that in the 50% quantile already, we talk about like 3x higher latency and server load, but it can go up, thanks to this resampling thing, all the way to 10x higher latency and 20x higher server load in the 99% quantile. So what does this mean for the bandwidth? I mean, we did here, they're just bigger. I mean, they're not just bigger, as we have seen, there's also this resampling, but they are bigger, that's for sure. So here, let me highlight two things. One, we were interested in understand just how long does it take to pack those bytes and bits on the wire. And we looked at it for 1 gigabit per second, 10, 100, and 400 gigabit per second network bandwidth, and we just said, okay, 10 gigabits is roughly 1 gigabyte, give or take, from an Ethernet perspective. So packing the bytes on a wire is not that much of a concern because already at 10 gigabits per second, we talk about 23 microseconds, just to shuffle the bits out, right? at the 10 gigabit that the line actually sucks those bytes in. That's good news. What's not so good news is, and it depends very much in which business you are, if you have a business which lives from answering super short questions for many, many people, like if you are hosting the US Open, if you are a bank where people at the end of the month just want to know, did my salary arrive or not? Or IAM, where you basically have gazillions of services just asking for a thumbs up, thumbs down in the form of some small token, you might expect a huge amount of session establishment and a minimum amount of data being transferred. In other situations, you do one session establishment and then you have mega and gigabytes of data where the session establishment time and network bandwidth is almost of no concern. But you have to know your setup to understand where you are. So what I did is I said, okay, if we have a situation where we have a building called a data center, and inside the data center is scaled out like crazy, so you have east-west bandwidth as much as you want, but eventually where the rubber hits the road and the big check is being written is when you go to your telecom fiber operator. And there, I mean, if you want to have a 400 gigabit per second Ethernet connection, that's quite expensive actually, right? So it's the data center wall plug network bandwidth that is concerning, not so much the server bandwidth because you can scale out. So if you look there, if you only do harvest now, decrypt later, so legacy certificates, the network capability of how many new sessions which could translate to new clients, which is a very important measurement, that already would cut it in half. So that's something that clients need to understand. If they're in a business where many clients just go and establish sessions, but then suck super little data, that's what they will see. Now, if you have two-stage certificate cert chains, now on top of just the key agreement, also authentication protection with Q-safe algorithms, then we talk about 10x. And if you're having a multi-chain certificate, or you also send the root certificate, then we talk about more like a 20x. So that is significant for certain use cases where the number of fresh sessions by far exceeds the amount of data that is transferred. So with that, I won't read everything again. It's just a summary of what I just highlighted, but I want to add an important point, namely everything you've seen here is from a really nicely behaved one session establishment sent, responded, session established, session turned down. The next on a full four-thread CPU for the client and on the server side. In reality, if you are not in the IoT world, but in the network aggregation point business like ingress controllers for clusters, then you have, bursts of requests coming in. And then some of the implications, some of the implementations for the algorithms say, yeah, we have 512 AVX, but yeah, we have like 2 on the chip. So be careful in thinking of what the overarching optimization of the code might do in a situation where you have massive amounts of parallel requests coming in because they are starting to fight for CPU resources, in particular vector engines. And with that, I hand it over to my dear friend, the moderator. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm wondering, the certificates that you used for those tests, did those have certificate transparency inclusion proofs? Because that would add 2 more signatures, or did you use OCSP that would add another signature?
Just pure flat stuff.
So essentially, the numbers that you were showing on cutting the number of potential handshakes in half will likely be even worse than that with real-world certificates.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I said clients were asking how many more CPUs do I have to install. That's a question, a valid question, but where it really hits is with your network bandwidth. And also, I mean, just in case that question comes up, why didn't you look at the SHA-based certificates? It's because of the humongous signatures that you have. I mean, people say, you only have to do it on the root, excuse me, because there we are quite convinced it won't be broken because it's hash-based. But the signature of the root, from the root algorithm is in the leaf certificate, which means you have to send the leaf, which means you have to send a signature from these hash-based algorithms over to the client. And there we talk about, just did look it up this morning, I think something between 17 kilobytes to 40-ish kilobytes, depending on the strengths. That's a lot. I mean, it's again really hurting your network. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Did you measure the memory impact, and why is it not a concern here?
I didn't measure it. It's actually a good question. I mean, to be frank, I was overwhelmed by the number of combinations that you could measure. So especially for this presentation, I do have more data, but for this presentation, I limited myself to some what I thought are key takeaways. So, for example, I also didn't summarize anything from the ciphers, where I also would have some comments on why is this digest being used in this TLS cipher and not the simpler one. Yeah, no, I didn't do that.
So do we have any other questions? Clemens?
On Tuesday, one of the Intel people was here and was showing comparison measurements in P384 performance with the Intel QAT provider versus OpenSSL upstream. And they had a 6 times faster P384. So I'm wondering whether you could maybe repeat those measurements with Intel QAT provider and what impact that would have on your recommendation to not use SEC P384 ML-KEM 1024.
Yeah, point one, not everybody is in the lucky situation to have this QAT. If you go to cloud people, I mean infrastructure people, and say, hey, please switch on this QAT feature, they say, are you nuts? Get lost. So, I mean, yes, I understand that these features are super helpful in certain circumstances. In others, you just can't get your hands on them, point one. And I mean, also, I would have loved that Tim would be here, because yesterday I pitched him and said, look, ML-DSA implementation sucks. I use that word. And it does, because you can do much better. And I mean, Ben from Deboring SSL just last week pushed some stuff where he did some tweaks on the ML-DSA and almost got twice the performance. So there's a long way to go yet. I would have hoped that over time, these real concerns about the tail latencies are somewhat improved. So yeah, there is, in various ways, room for improvement. Yes, if you have QAT, then yeah, use it if you can. I couldn't, because I just couldn't get my hands, I could get my hands on the CPU, but I couldn't arm twist the owners of the CPU to actually enable it. Yeah, and then, I mean, in the hyperscalers, they charge. I mean, they being Intel. If you want to have this feature, oh sure. But if you just want to have those CPUs that just barely make it out of the fab and have the specs, then they can sell them in large numbers, and QAT might or might not work on those chips. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Clemens, any other question? No. Okay, so thank you everyone. A big applause.